Ethics in Modern Slavery Research. Today's topic of the seminar. When we first carried out the consultations on our research priorities, so that was nearly 5 years ago, when we were created, there was a wide-ranging agreement that equity and inclusion of lived experience should be central to research on modern slavery. And that was reflected in our guiding principles, which are equity, survivor involvement, and impact on policy. But making research equitable and meaningfully including survivors in the research are easier said than done. And doing so must be underpinned by ethically robust funding mechanisms, methods, and practices that make it possible. This is why we commissioned a research project to examine ethical challenges in modern slavery research and to explore how inclusive, trauma-informed, and ethically robust practices can enhance both research quality, but also the outcomes for participants of the research. So the study was carried out by the University of Liverpool and the University of Nottingham, and it was published last week. Hopefully you had a chance to have a sneak peek of it. And it identified some critical areas for improvement, including for us here at the Modern Slavery and Human Rights PEC. So to tell us all about it is Dr. Wendy Asquith from the University of Liverpool, who led the research. Wendy has a wealth of experience in co-production in the modern slavery space. First, she was working on the Anti-Slavery Knowledge Network, working with partners in Sub-Saharan Africa to address exploitation as a global challenge. And then she began as a researcher at the Modern Slavery PEC, working on research into engagement of lived experience in international policy and programming before starting this project into the ethics of modern slavery research. Wendy, the floor is yours. And I'll try to get off the screen and share the presentation right now.
Thanks very much, Jakob. Hi, everyone. As Jakob says, my name is Wendy Asquith. I'm a lecturer in politics at the University of Liverpool, and I'm also a co-lead of the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre. First of all, I want to say thanks to MS PEC, to Jakob for setting up the event and for this opportunity to share findings from this recent work we've been doing on research ethics, particularly reflecting on practice in the field of modern slavery and human trafficking, but I think with resonances well beyond that subfield. I say we, not because I'm using the royal we, but because I want to acknowledge the fact that this work has very much been a team effort. So I'm here as the principal investigator sharing a summary of findings and recommendations from our research today. But you can see here on the title slide the names of all of the brilliant team members I've been working with to co-design, co-conduct this research, and who co-authored the report with me that's now available on the Modern Slavery PEC website. So do go and have a look at the full range of findings and recommendations there. I also want to take this opportunity to say thank you to the wider group of experts and participants who were willing to speak with us through focus groups, feedback sessions, or sharing thoughts by email as part of this research. All of those insights have been really, really rich and have helped us to reflect from a real range of perspectives on approaches to research ethics, to try and identify patterns of current challenges, opportunities for change, and to start to try and lay the groundwork to think collectively about how those approaches can be improved. So if we move over to the next slide, I want to first think about, I guess, like the challenge, set the scene for sharing our findings and recommendations. And I think it's worth saying a little bit about how this project first came about. So in late 2023, myself and the wider team were approached by the PEC and were commissioned to conduct this piece of research to assess current approaches to research ethics, specifically in the field of modern slavery and human trafficking. And I think there were a wide variety of drivers for this, but I think really key from the outset was a recognition that there'd been a really significant shift in our field, in the field of modern slavery and human trafficking in the preceding, say, 5 to 10 years. And there's an increasingly default expectation here that lived experience experts are directly and meaningfully involved in producing the evidence that informs policy and practice to address these issues. So, Jakob mentioned MSPEC itself is committed to being inclusive of lived experience expertise in its strategic delivery plan. And there are lots of other stakeholders, both in the UK and internationally, who are also doing this, who are working to embed lived experience expertise within their work and within their organisations. And that's, both because it's the right thing to do, but also because there's really clear evidence that there are positive outcomes of this for all involved. So, better, more relevant research and better policy making, improved organisational practices and improved social inclusion skills and professional development for all involved, including those with lived experience. And as I mentioned, this inclusion of lived experience expertise in the field of modern slavery and human trafficking research reflects a much wider shift in the research sector as a whole, where co-production, so the producing of research with communities affected by those issues, and efforts to sort of diversify and democratize the creation of knowledge, those sort of efforts are growing significantly. And so reflecting on the ethics of how we do that work has become increasingly more pressing. With those shifts towards more community engaged research practice have become a range of questions and points of challenge, healthy points of challenge, that ask researchers to reflect on their approaches to co-productive research and to really question whether current guidance on ethics and safeguarding has kept up with those shifts. So, are our existing frameworks around ethics and safeguarding fit for purpose? Before I dig into that, I just want to ask, I guess, these two key questions that have come up on the slide. What is research ethics and why does it matter? And think a little bit about what did we mean by research ethics when we undertook this project. So by research ethics, we're talking about the processes and practices built into research that ask researchers to reflect on the effects of their research for all involved. So the scope for their work to benefit or potentially harm those involved. And if harms are identified, it asks researchers to mitigate against those. It also asks researchers to reflect on the scope for those involved, including research participants, to exercise choice and influence and to be treated fairly when being involved in research. I don't want to sort of preempt our discussion of findings, but I think at a top line, it's fair to say we found significant unevenness currently in approaches to ethics with some widely divergent outcomes. So if we just click for the first quote, we've got a lot of quotes included in our report. There wasn't space to include a huge amount of those in the presentation today, but I wanted to share two at the outset that I think really demonstrate this unevenness of outcomes at the moment. So we've got a first quote from a lived experience expert who talked about positive experiences of being involved in research when survivors are involved in all aspects from the start to the finish. Where there's room made for survivors not just to be involved as participants, as a sort of tick box, but to lead research as well. And time and space made to ensure that everyone, including those with lived experience, really understand what the research is about, where it's going, how it's going to make changes. If we click for the next quote, you can see there's a real difference here from another lived experience expert who reflected on one experience of being involved in research. And, there's the same sense at the outset of excitement of looking forward to doing research, and then reflecting particularly on issues around payment, finding that actually the participation wasn't going to be compensated, and really feeling that that was a parallel to experiences of trafficking, feeling like that echoed the dynamics of trafficking. So, I think those two quotes next to each other really show the scope for current approaches to lead to very different and sometimes potentially damaging outcomes, which we really need to address. So what did we do and why? So if we click through to the aims and methods, we had three key aims for this research. Firstly, to take stock of current practice and consider its appropriateness, to share understandings of research ethics from a range of perspectives, and to make targeted recommendations. And with both of those, we were thinking about 5 particular stakeholder groups we spoke to and who we wanted to make recommendations for. So those were those funding research, research organisations, so universities and their ethics committees primarily, We also were consulting and wanted to offer recommendations for representatives of external partner organisations, NGO partners, those who aren't universities but are involved in research, for lived experience experts who have been involved in research, and also for researchers themselves and research teams. And just to quickly say that our methods for conducting this research were threefold. So we conducted a rapid desk-based review of both academic and other literature on this topic. We conducted a series of focus group interviews, and then we undertook qualitative analysis and tested those findings through feedback loops with our participants. And all that activity took place over around 5 to 6 months. Okay, so what did we find? We found 4 key areas for improved practice. That's how we've grouped our findings in our report. So there are 4 key chapters there that reflect on those different areas of practice that you can see here on the slide, where we found shared challenges and opportunities for improved practice. So I'm just going to go through each of these in turn now, if we go to the next slide. So first, we found a set of findings around ethical governance, and here we were focusing on the management of research and trying to scrutinise the practice of organisations that surround research teams, so often universities. And we wanted to examine how their existing systems and structures, including ethics committees, currently work to support or obstruct ethical practice. And I think we found, across these organisations, a range of systems, so ethics committees, financial departments, and who manage payment processes, but also, systems and structures around partnership working. We found that all of those systems often take what we call a deficit-oriented rather than assets-focused approach to thinking about work with lived experience experts, and that was particularly the case in the field of modern slavery and human trafficking, and other related fields where affected communities were being categorised as vulnerable. So to just unpack that terminology and explain it a little bit, a deficit-oriented approach is one that focuses on limitations and assumptions about who's capable of what, or, often who's assumed to be not capable of certain things. And we felt like this kind of approach, it was evidenced in a dominant focus on questions of safeguarding and vulnerability when dealing with lived experience experts and expertise. And we found that often overrided more asset-focused ways of working with these colleagues. So, an assets-focused approach would centre strengths, potential, experience and capabilities, and would lead to more empowering outcomes. When thinking about ethical governance, we also found a lot of consensus around the fact that payment processes were a real issue. I think, all stakeholders spoke to this issue quite strongly, and really identified that current funding arrangements in the sector, in the research sector, lag behind ambitions for research to be engaged with affected communities. So to do that work well, that shift in the sector, there really needs to be attention given to updating and transforming those processes to make this sort of work really possible. And we also found around ethical governance, there were questions about the equity of partnerships and funding arrangements between universities and external or NGO partners. So, questions about the extent to which the sharing of resources was equitable, but also, how does the sharing of risk, how does the balance of risk work for those partners, and who is the onus to provide support to research participants. So there were a lot of questions there about equity. If we move over to the next slide, we had a second sort of area of focus on ethical co-production. So here we were focusing on what it is to work in partnership well to deliver evidence on modern slavery and human trafficking, and with a special focus on reflecting on partnerships with lived experience experts. Our evidence here showed that there were concerns around one-size-fits-all models of ethics, so planning and review of research, that could create barriers to being inclusive in research practice. And we found those sort of one-size-fits-all models tended to reinforce power dynamics rather than address them, and would therefore result in extractive research practices rather than practices that would have benefits for all involved. So an example of this would be the assessing of risk and benefits by grouping all lived experience experts into one big homogenous group. So, thinking about modern slavery and human trafficking, which has lots of different expressions in different places, and the grouping of all people who might be affected by those issues into one homogenous group would tend to lead to the most vulnerable being marginalised and excluded from research. And that could even be in cases where people have self-referred and want to get involved in research. They may still be not able to be involved because of these sort of one-size-fits-all approaches. We saw particular concerns there about linguistic diversity in research. So particularly because our research was focused on the UK, a real concern about those who have English as a secondary language being excluded from research, often around concerns about informed consent, and a real lack of resourcing around translator and translation costs, which I think, can be addressed by the sector. And other related issues around ethnic and racial diversity, the involvement of those with uncertain immigration status, and for those who have childcare responsibilities, those were all concerns raised about research being fully inclusive of those groups. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to move on to the next slide around trauma-informed approaches now. So our third set of findings there focused on, ways to support positive interactions with those experiencing the lasting impacts of traumatic experience on their lives. That's what we're talking about when we think about trauma-informed approaches. And here we found that all stakeholders, again, there was a widespread consensus that trauma-informed approaches are needed. I think anyone working in this space will certainly be familiar with that phrase. But what this means in terms of practice is not evenly or clearly understood. That came across loud and clear. I think, frameworks for thinking about trauma-informed practice refer to usually a set of 6 principles: safety, trust, peer support, collaboration, empowerment through voice and choice, and cultural sensitivity. We really found that to date, in line with that sort of deficit-oriented approach I talked about earlier, we've seen particular attention being given to the care-focused aspects of a trauma-informed model, so attention to safety, trust, peer support, which are all really important and crucial, but if taken in isolation, they don't sort of emphasise strength, assets, agency, which the other 3 sort of principles in that space do. So there was a real need to think more holistically about trauma-informed approaches. So across the board, I think in summary on trauma-informed approaches, there was a clear sense of a need for more robust trauma-informed training for researchers and research ethics committees particularly, so that the empowering potential of inclusion in research could be realised, and that approaches to research that promote self-care, so avoiding issues like vicarious trauma for researchers, could also be promoted. Then finally, we had a 4th set of findings around ethical legacies. So, thinking about how we can realise that positive potential of lived experience involvement in research, but also the honest sharing of learnings from ethical challenges through research in the long term too. We found that, thinking about legacies of research, particularly for lived experience experts, it was not particularly well thought through at the moment in the longer term. And this was largely, we found as a result of the conditions in which research is happening. So, short-term funding models, project-to-project planning, thinking about legacies and long-term benefits for those with lived experience expertise is not currently a strategic sectoral conversation. And, it needs to be thought about in those terms rather than project-to-project. Lived experience participants also spoke particularly strongly on legacies about the need for more feedback loops after the collection of data, so before publication, to ensure that insights weren't being taken out of context or misused during data analysis. And there's a need for mechanisms by which ethics review processes can become more supportive of research teams, so less front-loaded, less attention exclusively to the planning stage, and more about ethics processes that sit alongside researchers as they conduct research, helping teams to navigate challenges rather than a tick box during the planning stage. Okay, so to wrap up then, what do we think should be done, or what are our recommendations? So in our report, we make a range of recommendations at the end of each chapter, and I don't have time to go over all of those now. So I would encourage people to go back to the report and look at those. And we split those priorities into things that we think should be taken, priorities for immediate action. And then we talk about changes to practice in the medium and longer term, the sort of structural shifts we think need to happen. As a top line, though, I think, we really felt that all those involved in research, funders, lived experience experts, researchers, universities and their partners, all those stakeholders can begin to take non-costed changes to their practice. So an example of that might be in the immediate term for universities to offer really accessible and transparent guidance to both their researchers and to lived experience participants on payment processes, on different options available and the implications of each of those. If there's lack of clarity in government guidance, which our evidence showed that there really were issues about the government guidance, then universities' guidance should also be clear about that lack of clarity, so that informed consent can really be given. Another example might be for researchers to develop clear processes to share findings and receive feedback from participants before publication of findings. That's something that can be done non-costed in the immediate term. Secondly, we wanted to make clear that actions needed beyond research teams' enhanced engagement with existing ethics review processes. So I think, this is not all about research teams failing, falling short and needing to perform better. Our research really showed there are structural shifts needed here, with universities and funders giving attention to whether they're creating the conditions in which ethical co-productive research can thrive. And finally, there needs to be a real cultural shift around research ethics. So it's seen not as a front-loaded tick box, but rather a process of continuous supportive review and reflection upon research practice and research governance. And I think I'll draw to a close there in the interest of time and pass back to Jakob.
Thanks so much, Wendy. That was great. A lot of information, a lot of useful stuff there for researchers, but also for us here at the PEC. Just a reminder, if we're going to move on to the Q&A now, if you have any questions, you could either post a question in the chat, we'll monitor those, or just raise your virtual hand. We'll do our best to bring you on the screen if you would prefer to join the conversation and ask a question that way. I'm going to start, and just an obvious question is, if you were doing a project, a similar project like this again, what would you do differently? What would you think about? How would you change your approach in doing this type of work? And perhaps particularly in terms of, maybe that's a separate question slightly, so two questions in one, in terms of the meaningful involvement of people with lived experience. How did that work in your project, and also what kind of lessons have you learned, and how would you do things differently?
Yeah, thanks, Jakob. I guess I can try and answer this all together, because I think, what was interesting about this project is, a lot of the issues, the structural issues we were speaking back to, also defined the space in which we did this research ourselves. So a lot of the findings really resonated with our experiences as we conducted the research on some level. And I think, what I would really like to see different in this space is the structural condition shift, so that this sort of research could there would be a longer term space for it, so like really opportunities for greater partnership building at the start, time to do that outside of project to project, so that we can do that sort of more a great space for thinking about legacies and benefits for all. In our project, we had sort of multi-level involvement of lived experience alongside other colleagues, so within our team, but also, the groups of participants we spoke to included those with lived experience expertise alongside funders and researchers, you know, and often, you know, we know that people wear multiple hats in those groups too. So obviously lived experience expertise intersects with all those other groups as well. It's not separate. And I think, you know, recognition of that, some of that complexity too, could be something that's drawn out more. I'm sure that there's much more to say to those questions, because I think they're really big issues. So if anyone from my team wants to jump in who's on the call, please do. But maybe I can think more about that as we take some of the questions as well.
Sure, and just a reminder, feel free to pose your questions. Don't be shy, or raise your hand. Or if someone from Wendy's team would like to jump on and add anything, please also raise your hand so I can bring you on the screen here. But kind of moving on to that, I was thinking it's a big piece of research. There's a lot of information, and it's all. What struck me when working on this, on publication of this report, was the complexity of the whole system, and it kind of how it goes beyond the research teams, and how the structural setup needs to be there in order for ethical research to work well. And I kind of landed on my with my communications goggles on, and imagine yourself in an elevator room with a funder stuck for 1 minute or 30 seconds. And I was wondering, what would you say to the funders of modern slavery research if you had a chance, but only a chance to say one or two things?
Again, like a really tough question, because I think, like you say, it's so complex and there's a lot. I think this, you know, this piece of research is only the start of this conversation, really. But I guess there are two really key, like, structural things that I think are priorities. One is that I think we need spaces within our sector that you know, that funders, universities, ethics committees could work together to resource and set up spaces where, you know, researchers, lived experience experts can talk together openly and honestly about the ethical challenges that they're encountering in research. Because, you know, we started to ask these questions and there's a lot of consensus across these stakeholder groups about where the issues are. But, you know, there's not a lot of open discussion about this at the moment. I think people are quite risk averse, quite worried about the implications of talking openly about challenges they've experienced ethically. So I think we really need those spaces resourced so that, you know, supportive conversations can happen around this. We can address challenges and problems so that they're not repeated in future projects. That would be the first one. The second thing that I think needs to happen, you know, structurally, which I sort of signposted towards the end where there was, you know, we really need a sort of sectoral level discussion around what an equitable package of investment looks like for lived experience experts in the sector. This is happening project to project. I think research teams are doing their best to try and think about, you know, skills building and, you know, positive legacies that they can build in, but it's a real challenge with limited resource and short-term projects. And I think there needs to be a bigger sectoral conversation, particularly if universities and funders want researchers to be doing this, you know, this kind of community engaged research, then it needs to be resourced properly.
Good stuff. Thank you, Wendy. We've got a question in the chat from Hannah Louise from the University of Sheffield. Thank you for this report and for the presentation. Could you expand on the points around payment? This is a particular barrier for paid engagement of experts by experience in larger institutions or universities, and specifically the engagement of those without right to work. How did that work, and what did you find in your research?
Yeah, so as I sort of mentioned, payment issues and problems with payment processes were really something, again, that came up for all stakeholders. You know, there seems to be a lot of confusion about what sorts of processes are possible. You know, there's not a lot of standardized advice out there, and I think research teams are often left to, you know, replicate having to search for this sort of advice themselves. You know, I think universities are not really providing clear advice on this for a lot of their research teams, and I think a lot of that goes back to a lack of clear government guidance. So in our chapter on ethical governance, we look at payments for significant chunks of that chapter, and I'd encourage people to go and look at some of the detail of that there. I'm not going to go through all of the technical detail of that now because it's quite complex, but there's a real sense that this should be about choice for lived experience experts. For any community participants who are taking part in research, it should be about choice, and it should be about catering to people's circumstance. So universities need to be clearer about what choices are possible and what the implications of those different reimbursement options are. There's a lot of push, particularly in this space, because of the nature of lived experience of modern slavery and human trafficking being about exploitation, and being sort of recognised and valued and reimbursed for work that you do is really important in this space. So there is a lot of pushback on voucher payments as a default. But obviously, where there are issues around right to work, that's often an option that's used as a default by universities. So there needs to be greater scrutiny of that. We do offer some advice in the report around that, but it's a bigger conversation that needs to involve the relevant government departments and universities having clarity for their research teams.
Yeah, that's a big conversation, a big problem. Just to flag, we have been working our lived experience advisory panel members have been co-producing a toolkit on the payment. So look out for that, because it's a much more complex problem than it seems to be. So hopefully that will offer a little bit of clarity, but it's a very complex problem. It definitely needs more work. I will try to bring Kimberly, who raised her hand, onto the screen. Kimberly, please bear with me. I hope I will be able to do that. And if you are able to unmute yourself, you should be able to.
Yeah.
So please feel free to add a question. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. So I was a lived experience consultant for the report. I just want to follow up on what we were saying about the payments. I think what we need is institutional change. And we need to have people with lived experience on board at the funding stage and the bidding stage. And when it comes to paying people with lived experience, they need to be on board before you start the actual research, so that you can make sure that they are remunerated in a way that is person-centered to them and to their circumstances, and that they have the choice of how they'd like to be remunerated. I'm aware that there's issues in terms of government guidance and things like that, but there are ways of going around it, but it's person-centered, and that's what we need to start applying. You cannot apply a one glove fits all. And the voucher issue is an issue. It results in restrictions in terms of what they can actually use the voucher for. We've had people lived experience have vouchers that are out of date. They don't fit the needs. They can't access that shop. It's not a great way to go. So if those discussions are had at the beginning of the project with the participants, so the participants have full control and decide, and then they're fully informed and everyone's transparent. They know when they'll get paid, how much and how. Thank you.
Yeah, that just to pick up on what Kim was saying there as well, like the timeliness of payments is also a real issue. We found that from gathering data, and I think our own experience on the project too, right? That there's a real issue with universities being able to provide timely payment at the moment, and that's also something that needs to be addressed with greater clarity around the processes.
Yes, thank you both. Thank you, Kimberly. That's great insight. On this, and I'm trying to pronounce the name well, is Bwalia, saying recruiting for research and recruiting for employment are two different things. It sounds like two different things, but it's quite complicated. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Wendy.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that we talked about in our chapter on ethical co-production was that I think at the moment there's a bit of a flattening of lived experience engagement in projects. So There are general principles around what's positive lived experience engagement and what's meaningful, and I think those are useful. But when it comes to opportunities to be involved in research, we need to much more clearly disaggregate between types of opportunity and role types, so that expectations can be really clearly set for people who might be interested in getting involved. So we can be really clear then about what are going to be the reimbursement options, what will that model look like, what are the training opportunities going to be, how much investment can people expect. You know, if we can disaggregate between what it means to be a research participant, which is usually something much more short term and project to project, rather than being a peer researcher or an employed member of a team or an organisation, then we can set much clearer expectations about what type of opportunities are being offered to different groups we want to work with.
Yes, it's like the common theme seems to be think about stuff way before you even start the project for everyone involved. But one more question from the chat from Julia, who is a PhD student, and she's asking, how can we as postgraduate researchers be ethical in compensating or remunerating research for participants with lived experience when funding for research is limited or simply not there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult one. And again, it speaks to the sort of structural conditions in which research is happening, you know. So then there need to be those bigger shifts and bigger conversations were happening. But I think in the short term, sometimes a really important question to ask is, well, should I be trying to push for direct involvement if I don't feel like I can compensate that properly? You know, if you don't feel like that's a possibility, then you need to look potentially at other ways of you know, making your research informed, you know, looking at the research that's already out there, the data that's already collected, and can you do that without trying to engage directly if you don't feel that it's possible to do that and to reimburse people well. So, you know, it's a really tough question, because I think we want to, you know, we want to do work that's robust and engage directly with communities and create those opportunities for people to work with researchers. But if it can't be done well, then we have to ask ourselves whether it should be done, I think.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? I wanted to ask one quick one. We've touched on this, but I was wondering, from your work with lived experience experts, what was the kind of main message coming from survivors, lived experience experts in the research?
I mean, I think, you know, as I said, across the presentation, you know, I think all of our stakeholders spoke to all of the issues. You know, there was no sort of silo of, you know, one set of stakeholders is only interested in this issue. You know, we mostly did qualitative analysis, but sort of internally within our team, we did do a little bit of, you know, looking quantitatively at how topics came up, and we found that all stakeholders spoke to all issues. So, you know, lived experience experts are, you know, cutting across all those other groups and involved in all of these conversations, and concerned about all of the issues. I think, you know, as reflected in our conversation here, payments was a big one, you know, and I think that's because of the nature of modern slavery and human trafficking being about exploitation, and, you know, a real sensitivity and awareness of you know, research practices not being extractive and exploitative. So that was a key issue. But, you know, there was concern with all the other issues around, you know, wanting positive innovation in this space too, you know, wanting to be part of those conversations that can make research much more equitable, that can support research teams to have better practices. So I don't think we could say there was one particular issue separate from the others, but part of that broader conversation.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think that's that's all we've got time for today. Thank you very much, Wendy, for your presentation, and to everyone for all your questions, and for coming to the webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. I will ask participants to click on the link that my colleague has just posted in the chat and give us a bit of feedback. It will only take literally 2 minutes. There's only a couple of questions there. This is for us to make these little meetings better and goes to make them go smoother and make them more accessible and enjoyable for everyone. You can obviously read about the ethics in modern slavery research research that Wendy's done on our website at modernslaverypack.org, and please sign up to our mailing list. The links are in the chat. Also, you can join our Google group, which has got, I think, over 300 people now, all modern slavery researchers and practitioners, so you can start conversations or make contacts or just promote your own research in there. Thanks very much to everyone, and see you at the next one.